By the autumn of 1944, the war had turned against Japan in ways even its most pessimistic planners had once thought impossible. The empire that had surged across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 was now shrinking under relentless American pressure. Saipan had fallen, Guam was gone, Tinian was lost. American B-29 bombers were beginning to strike the Japanese home islands. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, once the lifeblood of the Imperial Navy, could no longer move safely through submarine-infested waters. Japan's fleet still possessed powerful ships, but fuel was scarce, pilots were inexperienced, and the industrial base that could replace losses simply did not exist. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters faced a brutal reality. If the United States secured the Philippines, Japan would be cut off from its remaining oil supplies in Southeast Asia. Without fuel, even the greatest battleship in the world would be nothing more than steel drifting at anchor. The Philippines were not just another battlefield, they were the empire's last artery. If they were severed, Japan would bleed out, slowly, helplessly. The American return to the Philippines began on October 20, 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore on Leyte and declared, "I have returned." Behind that symbolic moment stood an armada of staggering scale, hundreds of ships, transports, escort carriers, fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The United States Navy had grown into something Japan had never anticipated in 1941, a machine capable of projecting overwhelming force across an ocean. Japanese naval planners knew they could not defeat this armada in a conventional, balanced engagement. They no longer had the air crews to challenge American carrier aviation head-on, but they still possessed something formidable, powerful surface ships, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, each armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. So they crafted a desperate plan. It was called Operation Show-Go, Victory Operation. In truth, it was less a plan for victory and more a calculated gamble. The concept was deceptively simple. Lure the main American carrier forces away from the invasion beaches with a decoy. Then send a powerful surface fleet through narrow straits, descend upon the vulnerable American transports in Leyte Gulf, and annihilate them at close range with battleship gunfire and torpedoes. Destroy the landing force, and the invasion collapses. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans would reconsider the cost of continuing the war. At the heart of this gamble was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa and his northern force. Ozawa's carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, were now shadows of their former selves. Ships like Zuikaku, one of the last surviving carriers from Pearl Harbor, would sail north with only a fraction of their intended aircraft complement. Many of their planes were outdated, many of their pilots were barely trained. The carriers were no longer intended to strike decisively, they were bait. The Japanese High Command understood that American doctrine revolved around carrier warfare. Since Midway, U.S. carrier task forces had become the spearhead of every major offensive. Japanese admirals believed that if American scouts detected a carrier force approaching from the north, U.S. commanders would react instinctively. They would move to destroy it. Carriers were the ultimate prize, the ultimate threat. The Americans would not ignore them. This assumption formed the core of Shogo's logic. If American Third Fleet under Admiral William F. Halsey saw Ozawa's carriers, it would likely pursue them aggressively. That pursuit would draw the fast American battleships and fleet carriers away from the San Bernardino Strait, the narrow passage between Luzon and Samar. And through that strait would come Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. 4 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Kurita's force was the hammer. Ozawa's carriers were the bait. Timing was everything. But even within Japanese circles, there were doubts. The plan required precise coordination among widely separated fleets. It assumed American commanders would respond exactly as predicted. It assumed Kurita's ships could survive repeated air attacks long enough to reach Leyte Gulf. It assumed that once inside the Gulf, the center force could inflict catastrophic damage before American air power returned. Yet Japan had little choice. Fuel shortages meant that much of the fleet could not conduct prolonged operations. If these ships were to be used, they had to be used now. Some officers privately acknowledged that show-go resembled a one-way mission. The fleet might be destroyed in the attempt, but in 1944, the alternative, inaction, meant strategic suffocation. As Kurita's center force departed Brunei Bay on October 20, 1944, it represented one of the most powerful surface formations Japan had assembled in over a year. Yamato and Musashi loomed over the escorts, their massive silhouettes symbols of a naval philosophy rooted in decisive battleship engagements. For decades, Japanese naval strategy had envisioned a climactic showdown in which superior training and night fighting skill would shatter an approaching American fleet. Now, that long-awaited decisive battle would unfold not on Japan's terms, but in defense of a collapsing perimeter. The sea lanes ahead were narrow and dangerous. American submarines prowled the approaches. U.S. carrier aircraft ranged far overhead. Every mile toward the Philippines brought Kurita closer to confrontation and closer to the possibility that the entire plan might unravel before it truly began. Meanwhile, to the north, Ozawa's carriers prepared to sail with far fewer aircraft than their flight decks were designed to hold. The irony was stark. These once dominant weapons of naval warfare were now nothing more than floating lures. Their survival was not the objective, their visibility was. As American forces consolidated their beachheads on Leyte, unloading men, tanks, ammunition, and fuel, few could imagine that a vast and intricate Japanese counterstroke was already in motion. The U.S. Navy believed it had shattered Japan's ability to conduct major fleet operations. In many respects, it had, but the Imperial Navy was not yet finished. Everything now hinged on one assumption: would the Americans take the bait? If Halsey committed his powerful carrier groups northward to destroy Ozawa, San Bernardino Strait would lie exposed. Kurita's battleships could slip through under cover of darkness and descend upon the vulnerable American transports off Leyte and Samar, and annihilate them at close range with battleship gunfire and torpedoes. Destroy the landing force, and the invasion collapses. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans would reconsider the cost of continuing the war. If Halsey committed his powerful carrier groups northward to destroy Ozawa, San Bernardino Strait would lie exposed. Kurita's battleships could slip through under cover of darkness and descend upon the vulnerable American transports off Leyte and Samar, and annihilate them at close range with battleship gunfire and torpedoes. Destroy the landing force, and the invasion collapses. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans would reconsider the cost of continuing the war. If Halsey committed his powerful carrier groups northward to destroy Ozawa, San Bernardino Strait would lie exposed. Kurita's battleships could slip through under cover of darkness and descend upon the vulnerable American transports off Leyte and Samar, and annihilate them at close range with battleship gunfire and torpedoes. Destroy the landing force, and the invasion collapses. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans would reconsider the cost of continuing the war. If Halsey committed his powerful carrier groups northward to destroy Ozawa, San Bernardino Strait would lie exposed.
Kurita's battleships could slip through under cover of darkness and descend upon the vulnerable American transports off Leyte and Samar, and annihilate them at close range with battleship gunfire and torpedoes. Destroy the landing force, and the invasion collapses. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans would reconsider the cost of continuing the war. If Halsey committed his powerful carrier groups northward to destroy Ozawa, San Bernardino Strait would lie exposed. Kurita's battleships could slip through under cover of darkness and descend upon the vulnerable American transports off Leyte and Samar, and annihilate them at close range with battleship gunfire and torpedoes. Destroy the landing force, and the invasion collapses. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans would reconsider the cost of continuing the war. If Halsey committed his...
At dawn on October 23, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force pushed steadily toward the Philippines. His formation was immense: 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. At its heart steamed Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, their 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing more than a small car over 20 miles. If they could reach Leyte Gulf, they would face mostly transports, escort carriers, and lightly armed screening ships. Against that kind of target, their firepower would be devastating. But before Kurita could reach the American invasion fleet, he had to survive the journey through confined seas, increasingly dominated by American submarines and aircraft. Shortly after midnight on October 23rd, as the center force passed through the Palawan Passage, 2 American submarines, USS Darter and USS Dace, detected the Japanese formation. Radar contacts resolved into cruiser silhouettes. The submariners could hardly believe what they were seeing: a major enemy fleet moving in tight formation, unaware it was being shadowed beneath the surface. At 5:24 a.m., Darter fired a spread of torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship. Multiple hits followed. Explosions ripped through the cruiser's hull, and within minutes she began to list heavily. Fires broke out. Ammunition detonated. Kurita himself was thrown into the sea as Atago rolled over and sank. He was rescued by a destroyer, but his flagship was gone. Moments later, Dace struck the heavy cruiser Maya with torpedoes of its own. Maya also sank rapidly. A third cruiser, Takao, was badly damaged and forced to withdraw. In less than an hour, Kurita had lost 2 major cruisers and suffered a third crippled, all before his fleet had fired a single shot at the Americans. The psychological impact was severe. The plan had barely begun, and already the center force was bleeding. Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato and pressed on. Shogo demanded aggression. Turning back now would render the entire operation meaningless. As the sun rose higher, American reconnaissance aircraft from the fast carrier task forces began locating Kurita's ships in the Sibuyan Sea. Reports flowed to Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet. The long-anticipated Japanese counterattack was materializing exactly where U.S. planners expected it. Halsey ordered waves of carrier aircraft to strike. By late morning, the first American planes appeared over the horizon: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters sweeping down toward the Japanese formation. The Sibuyan Sea erupted into anti-aircraft fire. Yamato, Musashi, and their escorts filled the sky with bursts of flak. Columns of water rose as bombs and torpedoes splashed near their hulls. The primary target quickly became Musashi. Slightly separated from the main formation and an unmistakable giant, it drew the attention of successive attack waves. Torpedoes slammed into her sides. Bombs punched through her decks. Flooding spread through compartments as damage control parties fought desperately to contain the water. Yet Musashi refused to die easily. Her armor was thick, her internal subdivision extensive. Even after multiple torpedo hits, she maintained speed.
Smoke poured from her superstructure, but her great guns remained silent, reserved for surface combat that might never come. Throughout the afternoon, American aircraft returned again and again. Each wave added more damage. Torpedoes struck port and starboard. Bombs exploded amidships and near the bow. The sea around Musashi churned white with explosions and foam. Kurita faced an agonizing decision. If he slowed to protect the crippled battleship, the entire formation would remain exposed to air attack. If he abandoned her, he would lose one of the most powerful warships ever constructed before she could fulfill her intended role in the decisive battle. By mid-afternoon, Musashi was in grave condition. She had absorbed an extraordinary number of torpedo and bomb hits. Flooding was uncontrollable. Her list increased steadily despite counter-flooding efforts. At approximately 7:30 p.m., after hours of punishment, Musashi finally capsized and sank beneath the Sibuyan Sea. The loss was staggering. One of Japan's two super battleships, a symbol of naval supremacy, had been destroyed almost entirely by aircraft. The very weapon Shogo hoped to evade had already claimed its largest prize. Under relentless attack and uncertain of the American fleet's full disposition, Kurita briefly ordered his force to turn westward, away from the Philippines. For American aviators observing from above, it appeared that the center force was retreating. Reports to Halsey suggested the threat had been neutralized, or at least driven off. But as darkness fell, Kurita made another fateful choice. He reversed course again and resumed his eastward advance toward San Bernardino Strait. The gauntlet had cost him dearly. 2 cruisers sunk, another crippled, and one of the most powerful warships in the world lost to air power. But the center force was not destroyed. It was bruised, diminished, but still lethal. And somewhere beyond the darkness of the strait lay the American landing fleet at Leyte, crowded with transports, ammunition ships, escort carriers, and thousands of soldiers depending on naval protection. If Kurita could break through before American carriers returned, the gamble of Shogo might yield a shocking and violent result. The night would decide whether the hammer still had a chance to fall.
By the evening of October 24, 1944, the battle had already taken a dramatic turn. American carrier aircraft had pounded Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force throughout the day in the Sibuyan Sea. The super battleship Musashi lay at the bottom. Several cruisers were gone or crippled. Reports from pilots suggested the Japanese force had turned away. To many aboard Admiral William F. Halsey's flagship, it appeared the central threat to the Leyte landings had been broken. But the war in the Pacific had a way of punishing assumptions. Throughout the afternoon, American reconnaissance aircraft had also been tracking another formation far to the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force. Radar plots and scout reports confirmed what every American naval commander had been trained to prioritize: enemy carriers. Even though Ozawa's carriers carried relatively few aircraft, their presence was unmistakable. Zuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force, sailed with light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. To American eyes, carriers were carriers. Since 1942, they had been the decisive weapon of naval warfare. Destroying them was always the objective. For Admiral Halsey, aggressive by temperament and confident in his fleet's superiority, the sighting of Japanese carriers presented an irresistible opportunity. He had spent much of the war seeking a decisive engagement against the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, at last, it seemed within reach. Inside 3rd Fleet headquarters, the critical decision loomed. Should Halsey divide his forces, leaving a powerful covering group to guard San Bernardino Strait while taking his fast carriers north? Or should he commit everything in a concentrated strike against Ozawa? Halsey chose concentration. He ordered the powerful Task Force 34, 6 fast battleships, along with cruisers and destroyers, to prepare to move north with the carriers. In doing so, he left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. The assumption was simple. Kurita's battered center force had been turned back. Even if it attempted to resume its advance, it would be too damaged to pose a serious threat. Yet unknown to Halsey at that moment, Kurita had reversed course after nightfall. Under cover of darkness, his surviving battleships and cruisers were approaching the narrow entrance to San Bernardino Strait. No American battleships blocked the passage. No carrier air patrols loomed overhead. The gateway to the Leyte landing area was open. As October 24 turned into October 25, the two fleets moved in opposite directions. Halsey surged north at high speed, determined to destroy Ozawa's carriers at dawn. Kurita slipped through the strait, emerging into the Philippine Sea and steering southward along the coast of Samar. Ozawa, for his part, understood his role perfectly. His carriers were bait. Their aircraft complements were skeletal, their pilots inexperienced. The Northern force could not win a stand-up fight against Halsey's veteran air groups, but they did not need to win. They needed to be seen. They needed to draw the American carriers away from Leyte. And they succeeded. Before dawn on October 25th, American carrier planes launched northward in massive waves against Ozawa's ships. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers swept down on Zuikaku and her escorts. The skies filled with anti-aircraft fire and smoke. By midday, Zuikaku would be sinking, taking with her one of the last symbols of Japan's early war dominance. But as American aviators celebrated their strikes to the north, something unexpected was unfolding to the south. At first light, lookouts aboard the small escort carriers and destroyers of Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, spotted pagola-style masts on the horizon. Moments later, towering water columns erupted around them as massive shells began falling from the sky. Kurita's center force had broken through. Instead of encountering the fast carriers and battleships of Third Fleet, Kurita found himself facing lightly protected escort carriers and a thin screen of destroyers. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled in over a year had arrived within striking distance of American ships supporting the Leyte landings. The assumption at the heart of Shogo had been correct. The American carriers had taken the bait. Now the outcome would depend on whether Kurita could capitalize on that opportunity, or whether confusion, misjudgment, and the fog of war would once again intervene. As the thunder of battleship guns echoed across the waters off Samar, the consequences of Halsey's decision became brutally clear. What had seemed a bold offensive move against enemy carriers had opened a corridor straight to the heart of the invasion fleet. In the span of a few hours, the balance of risk had flipped. The hunters to the north were destroying decoys. The real danger was to the south, where small escort carriers and destroyers suddenly stood between Japan's last great surface fleet and the thousands of soldiers ashore on Leyte. The gamble of Shogo had reached its most dangerous moment, not in the north where carriers burned, but in the narrow waters off Samar, where massive battleships now bore down on ships never designed to fight them. The trap had worked, but the battle was far from over. At 6:37 a.m. on October 25, 1944, lookouts aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay stared in disbelief. On the northern horizon, pagoda masts pierced the morning haze. Moments later, enormous geysers of water erupted around the small American ships. The shells were too large, the splashes too tall to belong to cruisers alone. battleships were firing. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had emerged from San Bernardino Strait undetected and was now bearing down on Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3. What stood in his path was not the fast carriers and battleships of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. Instead, he faced 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. These were ships designed to provide air support for troops ashore, not to duel with the largest surface combatants in the world. Kurita commanded 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. His flagship alone displaced more than any ship in Taffy 3 combined. On paper, the outcome should have been swift and catastrophic. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, immediately ordered his escort carriers to turn into the wind and launch every aircraft they could. Pilots scrambled into cockpits as deck crews rushed to get planes airborne. Some aircraft carried bombs or depth charges. Others launched with whatever ammunition was available. A few took off unarmed, intending to harass the enemy however possible. Meanwhile, the destroyers USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Heermann, along with the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler, faced a stark choice. They could stay close to the carriers and wait for annihilation, or they could charge. Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston did not hesitate. Without waiting for orders, he turned his ship directly toward the advancing Japanese fleet and accelerated to flank speed. A single Fletcher-class destroyer, armed with 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes, was now charging battleships whose main batteries could obliterate him with a single hit. Hull and Heermann followed. Smoke screens poured from their stacks, blanketing the escort carriers in a desperate attempt to conceal them. Through that smoke, the destroyers launched torpedo attacks at point-blank range by naval standards. Johnston fired a full spread of torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. One struck home, blowing off the cruiser's bow and forcing her out of formation. Under intense fire, Johnston was hit repeatedly by shells from battleships and cruisers. Her bridge was shattered, power failed, casualties mounted. Yet Evans continued to fight, steering manually, firing whenever a gun would answer. Hull pressed even closer, launching torpedoes before being riddled by heavy-caliber shells. She slowed, burning and listing, but kept firing until she finally rolled over and sank. Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort far smaller than the fleet destroyers, accelerated to speeds beyond her design limits to join the fight. Her captain maneuvered aggressively, closing the range to unleash torpedoes and rapid 5-inch gunfire. She struck a Japanese cruiser with multiple hits before being overwhelmed by superior firepower. She, too, went down after a fierce and improbable stand. Above the chaos, Taffy 3's aircraft began arriving over the Japanese fleet. Some pilots attacked with bombs and torpedoes. Others, having already expended their ordnance earlier in the morning, made dry runs, diving toward battleships with empty racks, firing machine guns, and forcing Japanese crews to maneuver defensively. Every minute gained mattered. Kurita's formation, built for coordinated surface combat, began to fragment. Ships maneuvered independently to avoid torpedoes. Smoke and rain squalls reduced visibility. Reports from lookouts were confused. Some Japanese officers believed they were engaging fleet carriers and major warships, not small escort carriers. The ferocity of the American defense created uncertainty. Kurita knew American fast carriers and battleships had been operating in the region. If this was merely the forward screen of a larger force, then his ships might soon face concentrated air attack from multiple directions. Despite his overwhelming advantage in guns and armor, Kurita faced mounting complications. Several cruisers were damaged. Torpedo tracks forced constant evasive action.
Communication between ships was degraded by smoke and maneuvering. The battle line he had envisioned, battleships methodically closing and destroying transports, never fully materialized. Around 9:20 a.m., after nearly 3 hours of intense fighting, Kurita made a decision that would be debated for decades. He ordered a withdrawal to the north. The reasons remain complex. He had lost cruisers and taken damage. He believed he was facing stronger opposition than expected. He was concerned about further air attacks once American fleet carriers returned. And he may have believed he had already disrupted the invasion enough to justify disengagement. For the men of Taffy 3, the withdrawal was almost incomprehensible. Ships were burning, hundreds were dead or wounded. Escort carriers like Gambier Bay had been sunk under heavy gunfire. Others were damaged. Yet somehow, against every expectation of naval theory and firepower, the Japanese center force was turning away. The smallest ships had stood in the path of the largest battleships ever built, and they had held. By midday, the waters off Samar were littered with debris and oil slicks. Survivors clung to rafts and wreckage as aircraft continued to circle overhead. The invasion fleet at Leyte, the true objective of Shogo, remained intact. Kurita's gamble had brought him within reach of one of the greatest tactical opportunities of the war. The American carriers had taken the bait. The strait had been left open. The invasion transports lay vulnerable. But in the face of unexpected resistance, confusion, and relentless harassment, the hammer had faltered. The last stand off Samar would become one of the most extraordinary naval actions in history. A battle where courage, aggression, and audacity disrupted a plan built on overwhelming power. The decisive battle Japan had long awaited had arrived, and it had slipped away.
By the end of October 25, 1944, the smoke over the Philippine Sea was beginning to clear. To the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy force had been shattered. The fleet carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force, was gone. Light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda had been sunk or finished off. What remained of Japan's carrier arm was no longer a meaningful offensive force. To the south, off Samar, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force had withdrawn after coming within striking distance of the Leyte invasion fleet. The transports, supply ships, and troop carriers that were the true objective of Operation Shogo were still afloat. American forces continued unloading men and equipment onto the beaches. The gamble had failed. Yet to understand why Japanese admirals had believed it could succeed, one must look beyond tactics and into the deeper imbalance shaping the Pacific War. By late 1944, the United States was producing warships at a rate no other nation in history had achieved. The centerpiece of that production was the Essex-class aircraft carrier. When the war began, Japan had entered the conflict with some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world and a highly capable carrier force, but it lacked the industrial capacity to replace major losses quickly. The United States, by contrast, mobilized an economy of staggering scale. Shipyards on both coasts worked around the clock. Steel, machinery, aircraft engines, and trained crews flowed into new hulls with relentless speed. 17 Essex-class fleet carriers would be commissioned during the war. 17. Each carried nearly 100 aircraft, supported by advanced radar, improved damage control systems, and well-trained air groups. By 1944, American carrier task forces could launch coordinated strikes involving hundreds of planes in a single wave. Japanese planners understood American strength in general terms, but many still clung to an older vision of naval warfare, one centered on a decisive battle between concentrated fleets. Operation Shogo was, in many ways, the final expression of that doctrine. Lure the enemy carriers away, bring the battleships into gun range, destroy the vulnerable transports, force a political reconsideration in Washington.
But by Leyte Gulf, the balance had shifted too far. Even as Kurita withdrew from Samar, American carriers were still operating in strength across the region. The loss of Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea had demonstrated beyond doubt that air power, not battleship armor, now dominated naval warfare. A single day of sustained carrier strikes had accomplished what opposing battle lines once required hours of surface combat to achieve. And there was no replacing those losses for Japan. The heavy cruisers sunk, the veteran crews killed, the fuel consumed. None of it could be restored. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the empire, had effectively spent its remaining strength in a final, desperate attempt to reverse the tide. For the United States, Leyte Gulf was not the culmination of production, it was the manifestation of it. Behind every carrier deck stood shipyards in Virginia, New York, California. Behind every strike aircraft stood factories in Detroit and Los Angeles. Behind every replacement pilot stood a training pipeline that Japan could no longer match. The appearance of overwhelming American carrier strength at Leyte was not accidental. It was the result of years of industrial mobilization and strategic planning. Even when Halsey had taken the bait and raced north, other American carrier groups remained active in the region. The depth of U.S. naval power meant that a single decision, even a controversial one, did not collapse the entire structure. For Japan, Shogo had been a last throw of the dice. It required precise coordination, favorable assumptions, and a degree of luck. Instead, it encountered submarines in the Palawan Passage, relentless air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea, and unexpected resistance off Samar. Each blow compounded the next. In the weeks following Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again mount a major surface offensive of comparable scale. Its remaining capital ships were increasingly confined by fuel shortages and constant air threat. The era of decisive battleship engagements, long anticipated in Japanese naval doctrine, had ended not in triumph, but in attrition and withdrawal. The Philippines campaign continued. American forces tightened their grip on the archipelago. Japan's supply lines from Southeast Asia were severed more completely with each month. Oil shortages grew acute. Aircraft production struggled without fuel. The strategic consequences of Leyte Gulf rippled outward, accelerating an already irreversible decline. Japanese admirals had mocked the idea that American industry could sustain such a torrent of ships and aircraft. They had believed that courage, superior night tactics, and a single decisive blow might offset material disparity. But by late 1944, the material disparity had become overwhelming. 17 Essex-class carriers were not just ships, they were evidence of a war economy operating at full throttle. They were proof that the United States could absorb losses, replace them, and return stronger. At Leyte Gulf, Japan sought to destroy an invasion and shatter American momentum. Instead, it revealed the limits of its remaining power. The decoy had worked. The strait had been left open. The opportunity had appeared. But opportunity alone could not overcome exhaustion, fuel shortages, industrial imbalance, and the dominance of carrier aviation. When the battle ended, the largest naval engagement in history confirmed a new reality. The Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer capable of altering the strategic direction of the war. Its greatest ships still floated, but they no longer controlled the sea. And from that point forward, the Pacific War would move steadily, relentlessly towards Japan's home waters, escorted by carrier task forces that embodied the industrial strength Japan had underestimated from the very beginning.